first thing Ethan Walker noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of an untouched forest, but the kind that feels wrong. Heavy, interrupted, as if something had been ripped out of the air. Birds were gone. Insects had stopped their low, constant hum. Even the leaves seemed to hold their breath. Ethan had spent nearly 15 years working in remote conservation zones, and he had learned to trust that feeling. Silence like this never came without a reason. He pushed through a curtain of vines, boots sinking into damp red earth, and that was when he saw it. The ground ahead was torn apart. Broken branches, flattened grass, dark stains soaking into the soil. Ethan's stomach tightened before his mind could catch up. He didn't need to see the bodies to know what had happened. He had seen this aftermath before too many times. Poachers didn't linger. They took what they came for and disappeared, leaving the forest to clean up the rest. He took one step forward, then another, and then he heard it. Not a cry, not a call, just a thin, uneven sound like air being dragged through something too small to hold it. Ethan froze. His heart began to pound loud enough that he was sure it would give him away, even though there was no one left to hear it. He followed the sound until he reached a cluster of broad leaves darkened with blood. Beneath them lay a tiny shape curled in on itself, barely moving. A baby gorilla. So small that for a moment Ethan wondered how he had survived at all. The infant didn't scream when Ethan knelt down. He didn't reach out. He didn't even try to crawl away. His chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps, eyes half open but unfocused, as if he had already begun drifting somewhere Ethan couldn't follow. Flies hovered close, bold in the heat. Ethan waved them away with a shaking hand. His throat tightened, and he had to swallow hard before he could breathe properly again. There was no mother. Ethan scanned the surrounding trees, already knowing what he wouldn't find. No protective shape looming nearby, no warning grunt, no furious charge, just emptiness. Whatever had happened here, it had ended quickly and violently, and this small life had been left behind by pure accident or by luck that felt almost cruel. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Every rule he had been trained to follow pressed down on him at once. Do not interfere, do not imprint, do not turn a wild animal into something that belongs to you. Conservation wasn't about saving one life at the expense of a species. It was about systems, balance, restraint. But this wasn't a system kneeling in front of him. It was a baby. The infant's fingers twitched weakly against the dirt, then stilled. Ethan's chest tightened again, sharper this time. He knew that look. He had seen it in injured animals and people pulled from wreckage too late. That distant stare that wasn't fear anymore, just exhaustion. "If I leave you," Ethan whispered, his voice barely sound, "you won't last an hour." The forest didn't answer. Ethan reached for his radio, then stopped. Backup was hours away, veterinary support even farther. By the time anyone arrived, the decision would already have been made by nature. Or by neglect. Slowly, carefully, Ethan shrugged out of his flannel shirt. It was soaked with sweat and smelled like smoke, and the last campfire he'd slept beside, but it was warm. He slid it beneath the infant, cradling the small body as gently as if it were made of glass. The baby flinched at the movement, a faint shudder running through him. But then something unexpected happened. His tiny hand closed not tightly, not with strength, but with intention around a fold of fabric. Ethan felt his breath catch. That single motion shattered the last barrier he had built around himself. This wasn't instinct anymore. This was contact, recognition, a living thing choosing not to let go even without knowing why. "I've got you," Ethan said, though he didn't know if it was true. "I don't know how, but I've got you." He lifted the infant against his chest. The baby's head rested just below Ethan's collarbone, small and unbearably light. Ethan could feel each fragile breath through his skin, too fast, too shallow, but still there. As he stood, the weight of what he was doing finally settled in. This wasn't a rescue he could undo later. There would be consequences, logistical, ethical, emotional. If the baby lived, everything about Ethan's life would change. If he didn't, Ethan didn't let himself finish the thought. The walk back to camp felt longer than it should have. Every snapped twig made Ethan tense, half expecting the forest to rise up and punish him for his choice. But nothing happened. The jungle remained silent, watchful, as if waiting to see what kind of man he would be. At camp, Ethan wrapped the infant in a clean blanket and warmed water over a small flame. His hands shook as he worked adrenaline, finally giving way to fear. He wasn't prepared for this. Not really. No manual covered moments like this. No training module explained how to hold a life that wasn't supposed to be yours. The baby didn't cry when Ethan offered him a bottle. He didn't reject it either. He just stared wide-eyed now, dark eyes fixed on Ethan's face with an intensity that made his skin prickle. It wasn't hunger in that look. It was something else. Something searching. Ethan sat there long after the fire burned low, watching the infant breathe, watching his fingers twitch, watching the smallest signs that he was still here. The forest slowly came back to life around them. Crickets resumed their song. Somewhere far off, a bird called. Only then did Ethan allow himself to wonder what this moment would become. He didn't know the baby's name. He didn't know if he would survive the night. He didn't know how this story would end. All he knew was that a life had been placed in his hands without warning, without permission, and without any promise of forgiveness. And somehow, impossibly, the baby was still breathing. That was enough for now to keep going. The first night, Ethan Walker stayed awake until dawn. Not because the jungle was dangerous. He had slept through storms, distant gunfire, and the restless movements of unseen animals before, but because the tiny weight pressed against his chest would not let him close his eyes. The infant gorilla breathed in shallow, uneven bursts, each one a question Ethan could not answer. He sat with his back against the wall of the shelter, one hand cupped protectively over the small rising chest, counting breaths, the way people count seconds when they are afraid of what comes next. He did not name the baby right away. Names felt too permanent, too hopeful, as if saying one out loud might tempt fate into taking the child away. For the first few days, Ethan referred to him only as the little one murmured softly into the dim light while warming bottles over a low flame. The baby did not cry. He rarely made a sound at all. He drank slowly sometimes, only a few drops before turning his face away, exhausted by the effort of staying alive. Ethan learned to move differently. He learned how to keep his voice low and steady, how to cradle the baby so his heartbeat could be felt, without being overwhelming, how to sleep, sitting up with one arm, curved just enough to keep the small body warm. He learned that silence frightened the baby more than noise, and that humming off key and awkward made the shallow breaths slow just a little. Days blurred together, then weeks. Somewhere between the fourth sleepless night and the first morning, the baby finished an entire bottle. Something shifted. The infant's fingers, which had mostly hung limp against Ethan's shirt, began to curl. First around fabric, then around skin. Weak at first, uncertain but deliberate. That was when Ethan finally allowed himself to say a name. Kaijo, he whispered one evening, testing the sound in the quiet shelter. The baby's eyes, dark and glossy, lifted toward him. Not in recognition, not yet, but in attention. Ethan repeated it softer. Kaijo. From that moment on, the baby seemed less like a fragile thing borrowed from disaster and more like someone choosing to stay. Kaijo grew slowly but steadily. His appetite improved. His eyes became brighter, more curious. He began to follow Ethan's movements with a focus that felt almost unsettling at times, as if every gesture was being stored away somewhere deep and permanent. When Ethan reached for tools, Kaijo reached too. When Ethan sat, Kaijo crawled closer, pressing his small body against Ethan's leg, as if anchoring himself there. At night, Kaijo refused to sleep anywhere but within arm's reach. If Ethan tried to place him on a blanket across the shelter, Kaijo protested not with sound, but with effort. He dragged himself back inch by determined inch until he could touch Ethan again. Only then would he settle fingers wrapped in Ethan's shirt breath, evening out as if reassured that the world had not shifted while he wasn't looking. Ethan documented everything, not for reports or donors or oversight committees, but because he was afraid of forgetting. He filled notebooks with observations that were less scientific than personal. He mimics my blinking today. He laughed when I pretended to fall. He hums when he's tired, not loud, almost like a memory. There were hard days too. Days when Kaijo refused food. Days when his stomach cramped and his small body trembled with fever. On those nights, Ethan stayed awake again, pressing cool cloths against warm skin, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. "You're okay," he would say. You're safe. I'm here. And sometimes, just sometimes, Kaijo would reach up and place a tiny palm against Ethan's chest, right over his heart. The first time it happened, Ethan froze. The pressure was light, uncoordinated, but intentional. Kaijo stayed that way for several seconds, then withdrew as if satisfied. Ethan didn't write about that moment. Some things felt too fragile for ink. As the months passed, Kaijo's strength surprised everyone who saw him. He climbed early. He learned balance faster than expected. He banged sticks together like crude drums and watched the sound echo with fascination. When Ethan returned from patrols scratched and exhausted, Kaijo studied the marks on his skin with intense focus, then leaned forward to press his forehead against Ethan's arm, unmoving as if trying to absorb what had hurt him. When Ethan fell ill with a fever one rainy season, it was Kaijo who refused to leave his side. He sat close, silent, and alert, occasionally reaching out to touch Ethan's chest, the way Ethan had touched his. The gesture was clumsy, untrained, but it was care. Anyone watching would have seen more than survival. They would have seen attachment. And that was what frightened Ethan the most, because he knew where this road led. By the time Kaijo was strong enough to swing easily through low branches and curious enough to wander beyond the shelter, without fear, the conversations Ethan had been avoiding finally arrived. Satellite calls, long pauses, words like readiness, transfer, reintegration. Kaijo was not meant to stay. Ethan understood that intellectually. He had always understood it. The goal had never been to raise a gorilla, it had been to give one a chance to return to where he belonged. But knowing that did nothing to soften the way his chest tightened every time Kaijo climbed into his cot. At night, small arms flung across Ethan's ribs, as if claiming space he believed was permanent. Still, hope existed in the small victories. Hope lived in the way Kaijo learned to forage on his own, in the way he responded to distant gorilla calls with hesitant curiosity instead of fear, in the way he began to spend longer hours exploring without checking over his shoulder for Ethan. Hope was not about keeping him. Hope was about letting him go and believing it would not erase what had been built. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the canopy and dust motes floated lazily through the shelter, Kaijo climbed onto Ethan's shoulder and rested his head there, heavy and warm. Ethan sat still, afraid to disturb the moment. Kaijo's breathing slowed deep and steady now, no longer the fragile gasps of a life barely hanging on. Ethan closed his eyes. He did not know what Kaijo would become. He did not know if Kaijo would remember him in years to come, or if memory would dissolve into instinct as the forest claimed its own. But in that moment, the future did not matter. What mattered was that a life that should have ended beneath a blood-stained leaf was now strong enough to dream. And for the first time since that silent clearing, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, saving one life had been enough to change two. Ethan knew the goodbye was coming long before anyone said the words out loud. It arrived quietly in the form of changed routines and careful silences, in longer meetings over crackling satellite calls, in reports that praised Kaijo's strength, his adaptability, his growing independence, in the way the word ready appeared more often, no longer tentative, no longer conditional. Kaijo was ready. The realization did not hit Ethan all at once. It settled into him slowly, like weight added grain by grain. He felt it when Kaijo spent entire mornings exploring without checking back, when he slept in the high branches instead of the shelter, when he ignored Ethan's humming and instead answered distant calls with a low, unfamiliar rumble that vibrated with something older than either of them. The forest was beginning to claim him. That was the point. That had always been the point. Ethan reminded himself of that each night, even as Kaijo returned at dusk, dropping down beside him with the careless trust of a child who did not know the meaning of permanence. Kaijo still pressed his forehead briefly to Ethan's chest before settling nearby, still reached for him when startled, still mirrored his movements in small, unconscious ways. But the bond had changed. It was no longer about survival. It was about transition. The official decision came on a gray morning rain whispering through the leaves. Ethan stood beneath the shelter roof, listening as the voice on the other end of the call explained timelines and protocols. A protected release zone, a semi-integrated troop, no direct human contact, no lingering. When the transmission ended, the forest felt unnaturally loud. Ethan stayed where he was, hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing. Kaijo approached from behind, curious, and tapped Ethan's shoulder twice with his fingers. Ethan turned slowly. For a moment, he almost told himself it was still possible to delay. A few weeks, a month. There was always another reason, another justification. But he saw the truth in Kaijo's posture now. In the way he stood taller, more grounded. In the way his gaze moved past Ethan instead of stopping with him. Love had done its work. The days that followed were the hardest Ethan had ever lived through, not because of chaos, but because of restraint. He had to begin pulling back in small, deliberate ways. Fewer touches, less eye contact. No shared meals. Kaijo noticed immediately. At first, he protested in the only way he knew how, by staying close, sitting just within reach, watching Ethan with a quiet intensity that felt almost questioning. Ethan forced himself not to respond. He kept his movements neutral, his voice minimal. Every instinct screamed against it. Teaching someone to let go felt cruel, but teaching someone to belong to the wild required it. On the final morning, the crate waited near the clearing. It was larger than Kaijo remembered from early transport drills, reinforced, but open to light and air. Inside, Ethan had placed a few familiar items, a worn piece of cloth that carried his scent, a wooden object Kaijo had chewed into soft edges, and nothing else. No photographs, no tokens that would tie Kaijo backward instead of forward. Kaijo circled the crate once, curious but cautious. He touched it, sniffed the edges, then looked at Ethan. Not alarmed, just attentive. Ethan knelt. This was the moment he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind and still felt unprepared for. He rested his forehead briefly against Kaijo's, just once the way he had done when Kaijo was small and frightened. The contact was light, respectful. He did not linger. No cages after this, Ethan said quietly, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. Just trees. Kaijo did not resist when the handler stepped forward. He entered the crate without panic, glancing back, once eyes searching. Ethan held his position. He did not reach out. He did not speak again. The crate door closed with a soft final sound. As the vehicle pulled away, Ethan stood rooted to the ground. He did not wave. He did not follow. He watched until the forest swallowed the path completely, until there was no sign left of movement or machinery or transition. Only green. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was hollow. The shelter felt too large. The morning stretched without purpose. Ethan found himself listening for sounds that did not come, for soft hums, for clumsy footsteps, for the small disruptions Kaijo used to bring with him wherever he went. His arms felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with physical absence. He packed the cot away. He forced himself to move camps. Weeks passed, then months. Reports arrived, sporadically stripped of emotion and rich with data. Kaijo was adapting. He lingered near the periphery, at first cautious but curious. He observed before engaging. He learned quickly, groomed when invited, stepped back when challenged. He remembered how to listen. Ethan read each update carefully, lingering over every word. He memorized the descriptions, replayed them in his mind. He told himself this was success, and it was. But success did not feel like relief. The hardest part came later, when the reports changed tone. Kaijo was no longer described as adapting. He was integrating, rising in confidence, displaying early signs of leadership. The language shifted subtly, unmistakably. Kaijo no longer needed Ethan. That truth landed harder than the goodbye itself. One night long after the decision had passed and the forest had returned to its routines, Ethan sat alone by the fire with one of his old journals open on his lap. He read entries from the early days, fragile handwriting, frantic notes about feeding schedules and breathing patterns. He finished the bottle today. He slept through the night. He laughed. Ethan closed the journal. He realized then that the hardest goodbye had not been the moment the crate door closed. It was this accepting that the bond he had built was never meant to be permanent in form, only in meaning. Kaijo had not been given to him to keep. He had been given to him to return. The forest does not reward attachment. It rewards readiness. And Ethan had done his job well enough that letting go was no longer an act of loss, but of completion. Still, as he lay down that night beneath a sky thick with stars, Ethan whispered into the dark, not as a call, not as a hope, but as acknowledgement. Go be who you are. And somewhere far beyond his sight, beneath the same canopy, a young gorilla slept in a nest of leaves, strong and alive, carrying with him a memory that no one could measure, but that would never fully disappear. Some goodbyes do not end a story. They begin the part where it finally belongs to the wild. Years passed without ceremony, not marked by anniversaries or milestones, but by erosion of habits, of expectations, of the sharp edges of memory. The forest reclaimed its rhythms, camps moved, projects ended, new ones began. Ethan no longer counted time by seasons the way he once had. He counted it by distance. Distance from that clearing, distance from the boyish weight that used to lean against his knee, distance from the belief that some bonds required constant tending to survive. He was older now, quieter. His work had shifted from the immediacy of rescue to the patience of oversight. He trained younger conservationists, reviewed field data, spoke in measured tones about ecosystems and outcomes. When Kaijo's name appeared in reports, it did so without sentiment, just coordinates, behavior notes, leadership markers. Healthy, dominant, adjacent, fully wild. Those words should have brought closure. Instead, they hovered incomplete. The call that brought Ethan back came without warning. A documentary crew had requested a consultant, someone who knew the terrain, the history, the patterns of movement along the reserve's eastern corridor. Ethan accepted without thinking too hard about why. He told himself it was professional, necessary. He did not mention Kaijo to anyone, not even to himself. The helicopter dropped them miles from the release zone. The forest closed in immediately, thick and damp, alive, with the low murmur of insects and distant calls. Ethan felt it in his chest before he acknowledged it. In thought, the subtle tightening, the awareness that some places do not forget who has walked them before. The first days passed in routine. Equipment checks, trail assessments, quiet conversations at dusk. Ethan slept lightly, waking often, listening to the dark as if it might speak. On the third morning it did. The sound was low, rhythmic, carried on the edge of air, not loud enough to demand attention, not random enough to ignore. Ethan stopped mid-step. His boot hovered inches above the ground. The forest seemed to lean inward. He had not heard that sound in years, but it lived intact somewhere beneath memory, unaltered by time. Another call followed, closer now, deliberate. Ethan's pulse quickened, not with fear, but recognition so sharp it bordered on disbelief. He turned slowly, scanning the dense curtain of green. The crew behind him murmured, unaware of what he was hearing, what was already moving toward him. Branches cracked, a shape passed between trunks, black fur, broad shoulders, a presence that shifted the air around it. Someone whispered a warning. A camera lens lifted. The forest held its breath. Then Kaijo stepped into the clearing. He was larger than Ethan remembered, his frame thick with authority, silver, beginning to dust his back. His eyes were darker now, steadier. This was not the young gorilla who had once clung to him for reassurance. This was a leader shaped by distance and choice. Kaijo saw him. The recognition was immediate. Not frantic, not confused, focused. He charged. The world fractured into sound and motion, shouts, a gasp, the thud of massive limbs against earth. Cameras shook, someone screamed. Ethan did not move. He dropped to his knees without conscious decision, palms open and spine straight. He did not raise his arms. He did not lower his gaze. He simply stayed where he was, letting memory do what instinct could not. Kaijo stopped just feet away. Dirt sprayed. The ground trembled beneath his weight. His fists clenched, muscles coiled with force that could end a life without effort. His breath came heavy, measured. They locked eyes. Time stretched thin and fragile. Kaijo tilted his head slightly, first to one side, then the other. His nostrils flared. He leaned forward just enough to test the space between them, then paused. The forest exhaled. A sound left his chest, not a roar, not a display, but a low, broken grunt. The same one Ethan had heard in the shelter years ago in moments of uncertainty, of need. Ethan's breath caught. He did not speak. He did not reach out. He let the sound exist between them, shared and unclaimed. Kaijo lowered himself slowly, deliberately, the way he once had as a juvenile learning restraint. He moved forward on his knuckles, closing the distance inch by inch, eyes never leaving Ethan's face. When he stopped, they were close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his breath. Kaijo pressed his forehead gently against Ethan's. The contact was brief, light, reverent. Somewhere behind them, someone sobbed. Ethan raised one hand and rested it against Kaijo's shoulder, not gripping, not claiming, just acknowledging. His voice, when it came, was barely sound. "You remember." Kaijo made no reply. He stayed for a moment longer, breathing steady present. Then he leaned back, rose to his full height, and stepped away. No roar, no demand, no hesitation. He turned and disappeared into the forest, leaves closing behind him, as if he had never been there at all. The clearing remained frozen long after he was gone. The footage would travel far. It would be replayed, analyzed, argued over. Experts would debate whether it was conditioning, coincidence, projection. None of them would be wrong enough to explain it away. Ethan did not watch the recordings. That evening he returned alone to the clearing. No cameras, no crew. Just the imprint of something that had happened and did not need repetition. He knelt where Kaijo had stood. The forest was quiet again, but not empty. Ethan understood then that the answer he had never asked had finally been given. Not in reunion, not in permanence, but in recognition without possession. Kaijo had not come back to reclaim a past. He had come to acknowledge it and move forward. The forest had answered not with spectacle, but with restraint, with the kind of memory that does not bind, only bears witness. And for the first time since the day he let go, Ethan felt something loosen inside him. Not loss, not longing, completion. Some bonds do not ask to be held again. They only ask to be remembered and then allowed to walk away. The world did not return to normal after that day. It tried to. News cycles moved on. Another story replaced the last. But something subtle had shifted inside Ethan and inside everyone who had witnessed what should not have been possible and yet had happened without force or explanation. The footage traveled faster than Ethan ever could. Unedited clips, no narration, just a man on his knees and a silverback stopping inches from him. Viewers replayed it again and again, searching for meaning in frames and pauses. Comment sections filled with certainty and doubt in equal measure. He remembered. No, it's conditioning. That wasn't fear. That wasn't instinct. Ethan did not participate in the debate. He declined interviews. He ignored requests for commentary. He did not want to reduce the moment into something manageable. What had happened in the clearing did not belong to spectacle. It belonged to restraint. Back at the reserve, life continued in quiet, measurable ways. Rangers tracked movement patterns. Drones captured distant images. Kaijo appeared in reports again, not as an anomaly, not as a symbol, but as a presence, leading, teaching, protecting. He was seen guiding juveniles away from danger, correcting disputes without escalation. He slept at the edge of the troop alert but unthreatening. The younger ones followed his calls without question. He was not gentler because of memory. He was steadier. Ethan read every report carefully. He noticed what others overlooked. Kaijo did not linger near human paths. He did not seek out observation points. He had not returned to the clearing. There was no attempt to repeat the encounter. That mattered, because remembering was never the same as returning. Months later, Ethan walked the perimeter of a new project zone far from the place where Kaijo lived. The forest felt different here, less familiar, less charged. He welcomed that. He was not searching anymore. One evening, as the light thinned and the canopy darkened, Ethan sat alone on a fallen log and opened his old journal. The pages were brittle now, edges curled with humidity and time. He read slowly, notes about feeding schedules, sketches of small hands gripping cloth, descriptions of sounds that no longer echoed anywhere nearby. He realized something then that surprised him. He did not ache the way he once had. The sharpness had softened into something quieter. Gratitude, maybe, or trust. Trust that what he had given had not been erased by distance. The forest does not reward memory with return. It rewards it with continuation. Kaijo had not come back to be reclaimed. He had come back to acknowledge a truth and then release it. He had remembered and then he had walked away. That choice mattered more than any embrace ever could have. Ethan understood now that the moment in the clearing was not the climax of their story. It was the punctuation, a pause that confirmed the sentence had already been written. The world wanted endings that stayed. The forest offered endings that moved. Years passed. Ethan transitioned fully into teaching. He stood in front of classrooms filled with students who listened wide-eyed as he spoke about ecosystems and ethics, about intervention and restraint. He did not tell them Kaijo's story as a miracle. He told it as a responsibility. Just because an animal remembers you, he would say, doesn't mean you get to stay. Sometimes a student would ask if he ever wanted to see Kaijo again. Ethan always paused before answering. No, he would say gently. I needed to know he was okay. I didn't need to be there for that. Somewhere in the reserve, Kaijo aged as all leaders do, slowly, visibly, with dignity. His silver spread. His movements grew more deliberate. He taught through example, not force. The troop mirrored him. Occasionally, a drone captured an image of him resting beneath a tree, juveniles pressed close, listening. In one still frame, his head tilted slightly toward the forest beyond, eyes half-lidded. The researchers marked it as vigilance. Ethan saw something else. Memory does not ask to be proven. One morning, years after the clearing, Ethan returned to the forest alone. No equipment, no agenda. Just a final walk through familiar ground before moving on to something new. He stopped beneath a tall tree, one that had stood long before either of them, and would remain long after. He sat and spoke aloud, not as a call, not as a hope. He read from his journal, stories of nights by firelight, of fear that turned into trust, of letting go before love became possession. He did not expect an answer, but as he closed the notebook and stood to leave, a sound drifted through the trees, soft, distant, measured, not close enough to follow, not loud enough to demand, just enough to be unmistakable. Ethan smiled. He did not turn toward it. He did not stay. Some connections are strongest when they are allowed to remain unfinished. Kaijo did not need to come back to prove anything. He had already shown the world what memory could be when it was paired with choice. He had remembered, and then he had walked away, not because the bond was weak, but because it was complete, and that Ethan knew now was the rarest ending of all. Some stories stay with us, not because of what happened, but because of what they quietly reveal. At first glance, this is a story about a man and a gorilla, about rescue, separation, and a reunion that defied expectation. But beneath the surface, it is really a story about responsibility, about what love means when possession is no longer an option, and about the courage it takes to step back instead of holding on. Ethan did not save Kaijo to be remembered. He did not raise him for recognition, gratitude, or reunion. He did it because a life was placed in his hands, and turning away would have been the wrong choice. That decision changed both of them. But the true measure of Ethan's character was not found in the rescue itself. It was found in the goodbye. Letting go is rarely celebrated. In our world, we praise attachment, loyalty, and visible devotion. We admire bonds that endure through proximity. But this story challenges that instinct. It asks a harder question: what if real love isn't proven by staying, but by knowing when to leave? Kaijo did not return to Ethan because he needed him. He returned because memory exists beyond usefulness, beyond survival, beyond instinct. And when that recognition had been made, when both sides knew the bond was real, Kaijo walked away. Not in fear, not in confusion, but in strength. That moment teaches us something deeply uncomfortable and deeply necessary: connection does not entitle us to permanence. In conservation, in parenting, in relationships of every kind, there is a temptation to hold on past the point of help, to confuse care with control, to believe that because we played a role in someone's survival, we must always remain part of their life. This story gently dismantles that belief. It shows us that the most ethical choice is often the most painful one. Another lesson lies in memory itself. For decades, humans have drawn sharp lines between animal behavior and emotion, between instinct and remembrance. Kaijo's response does not demand that we humanize animals, but it does demand that we respect them. It reminds us that experiences leave traces, that kindness is not a race simply because it crosses species boundaries, and that what we give freely can return in unexpected ways. But perhaps the most powerful message of all is this: not every meaningful story needs to continue in front of our eyes. The reunion was not the climax. The walking away was. Because growth is not proven by clinging to the past, but by moving forward without denying it. Kaijo did not forget Ethan, and Ethan did not need Kaijo to stay in order to know their bond mattered. That balance, rare and fragile, is something many of us struggle to achieve in our own lives. We can learn from this story not to chase every connection, not to demand proof from love, and not to fear endings that come with dignity. Some bonds are meant to change shape, not disappear. Some love is strongest when it steps aside and lets life continue on its own terms. In a world that often confuses attention with meaning, this story reminds us to value silence, restraint, and respect. To recognize that the greatest impact we can have on another life is not ownership, but preparation. Not presence forever, but support until it is no longer needed. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see the natural world and your own relationships a little differently, that means it has done its job. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories about memory, compassion, courage, and the quiet choices that shape lives long after the moment has passed. Subscribe to the channel to support more meaningful animal stories like this. Your support gives us the motivation to keep listening, keep learning, and keep sharing the moments that remind us what love looks like when it is truly selfless.